Welcome everyone to an episode of me and my sore throat. Today is Thursday, December the 28th. This is also the 187th anniversary of the independence of Mexico from Spain. Pretty packed end of the year when it comes to celebrations and festivities for Mexicans, I guess. And even the Spanish should probably celebrate getting rid of Mexico, to be honest. Now, on this day, we have our update, our recap on what's been going down in Mythic Plus. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because last week was the week where we got through a full reset of the balance tuning that happened on December the 19th. So we have gotten, for example, nerfs to Havoc Demon Hunter, we have gotten nerfs to Assassination, we have gotten buffs to Devastation, all 3 mage specs, Destruction, Affliction, we have gotten Elemental Shaman, we have gotten Ret Paladin, Windwalker Monk, and a whole bunch of changes to the specs. So in our recap last week, it was too early. It was too early, just a couple of days into the week, to try to gauge how much of this was changing. But now we have gone through a full week, actually 9 days since the set of tuning. So we get to check how things have been going in Mythic Plus, with the added bit of also checking how the balance tuning has affected the performance of every spec that was, changed by the tuning. Talking about the specs themselves, that's where we can start looking at the major differences based on the balance tuning, starting from the DPS that were affected by the changes. The first funny one to look at is comparing this last reset that just ended with the one prior. So the 937th one was prior to the balance tuning, and the 938 was the week after the balance tuning. You can see the average damage of a Havoc Demon Hunter post nerf being 263,000 in Mythic Plus keys. You go before the nerfs and their damage is exactly the same. So, the set of nerfs given to Havoc did not seem to have affected too much the performance of the spec. However, we can see plenty of more meaningful changes, like for example the 3 mage specs, because the 3 mage specs before the buffs were at 190, 180 and 163. You look at the week after the buffs and Fire is not at 180, is at 205. Frost is not at 190, is at 202. And Arcane is not at 163, is at 180. Obviously, these numbers are not nearly as big as the results we saw in-game. Fire was not buffed by 15% in damage with these changes, but those are the results that are showing up in last week's performances of the specs in the top keys. These are up to the 4,000 highest keys done by each spec. Of course, certain specs will not be nearly as popular to be able to get that high in key level, but in general, you can see the results, positive results for the buffs to mages. You can also see the same thing when it comes to another one, the bigger one of the buffed specs this week, which was Windwalker. So Windwalker was chilling at 173,000 DPS prior to the buffs on average in your high-ish 25 plus, more or less Mythic Plus key. Now they go from 173 to 214. This is a 25% damage increase. Massive damage. The buff themselves show up at 10 to 12% in AoE. So not nearly as big as this big boost of damage that they have received, this +8 in ranking positions last week after they got buffed. This is another classic case of the more a spec is doing well, the more top players, the more high quality players will go and play the spec. So before the buffs, Windwalker wasn't just doing badly because they were weak, they were also doing badly because they weren't being played by that many top players, because top players are competitive. If they are competitive, they're not going to be playing a terrible spec. So after Windwalker got its many buffs, now more high quality players are playing the spec, which means the results show up much higher. Similar case can be said, for example, for the Warlock specs, in particular one of the two, because prior to the changes, Destruction and Affliction were literally sitting at the bottom, 151 and 144,000 average DPS. After the buffs they have received, the 151 of Destro goes to 185. So we are talking about 20 over, 22% damage increase for Destro. Affliction, not quite as high as Destruction, but it does show you, it does paint a picture where these two buffs for the specs were not nearly as big as the damage shows now in the results. It's just that, for example, more high quality players, high key pushers playing demo tried out the two specs after being buffed, for example, so they are better able to perform on them, and it shows up even more now that the specs are buffed. Another case, although this one is sadder, because talking about the bottom specs, you have Devastation. Devastation is unfortunately chained by their counterpart, Augmentation. So even if the buff looks quite powerful in terms of damage increase, especially in AoE to Devastation, you can see they go from 155,000 on average all the way up to 178,000, so it's a 23,000 damage increase, it's a 15% damage increase, but you know, it doesn't seem like for now anywhere near enough to start making players wonder if it's worth bringing a Devastation Evoker over an Augmentation Evoker. Also, talking about the top players of certain specs moving to play that spec if it becomes powerful, it doesn't seem like it will be the case for all of the very good Devastation Evoker players who are now in Augmentation Prison and not playing Devastation for the time being. One curious case in terms of buffs was the AoE damage buff given to Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest has not been having too great of a season right now. After enjoying some good time as part of Exodia in Season 2, the many nerfs brought over in Season 3 have left them quite weak. However, what's interesting about their situation is that this is them being last, and before actually being buffed, they weren't even last. The reason why this happens is, of course, because the three ones below Shadow are three of the specs we just mentioned being buffed. So even though Shadow was buffed and they went from 156,000 average DPS all the way up to 165, it's still too small of a damage increase of a buff to make them move anywhere, and if anything they lose positions because the similarly weak specs that were just as low as they were have got them buffed for more. So talking about the increase in rankings, you can see the +8 of Windwalker being buffed, you can see the +3 of Fire being buffed, the +12 of Destro being buffed, as well as Arcane being buffed, Devastation being buffed, and Affliction being buffed. The nerfs. Of course, immune to any damage, the nerf to Havoc Demon Hunter didn't really do much. The other one that lost the most in terms of changes is the whooping -15 of Assassination Rogue. Now, if you're confused, you are right. Assassination Rogue wasn't even nerfed that massively. It was just a 3% damage nerf. If you go before the nerfs, Assassination was in the top half, doing quite well, also being very popular, doing 185,000 DPS on average. The week after, it goes all the way down to 165, and the play rate goes from capping at 4,000 to almost half as much that number. So it's interesting because the nerf is only 3%, yet they lost 13% damage. What's also even more interesting is that Subtlety right now is at 182, the week before the changes it was at 159, so they gained 13% more damage, yet Subtlety was not changed in the patch. That could be the signal for another one of the cases where the best players go and play something else once a spec is nerfed, for example, or they go and play the spec that's being buffed. So the results of the spec are also increasing, not just because of the buffs, for example, but also because better players are performing on the spec. In this case, you see Assassination losing 13% of damage and Subtlety gaining 13%, even though Subtlety wasn't nerfed and Assassination was only nerfed by 3%, yet they are losing this week, they are losing way more than that. So we have seen quite a significant amount of swings when it comes to the DPS performances in this last full week of the season. Obviously now we're only a couple of days in because the period has just started, so you can see the number of runs are just way too small to gauge any numbers. You do see some of the similar names we just mentioned at the top, of course, and similar ones we have mentioned at the bottom, but to have a better idea of a full week, we stop to the week that just ended, and these are the results so far for the DPS. Not too much that we can see when it comes to tanks and healers, mostly because tanks were not actually being touched this week in terms of changes, besides the small nerf of the Sigil of Flame damage for Vengeance. So Vengeance was at 134,000 average DPS after this supposed nerf. Before that, they were at 134 anyways, so who cares about nerfs apparently when it comes to Demon Hunters? There was also a nerf to the healing of Mistweaver, but nerfs to heals are much less likely to show up, are much harder to show up when it comes to Mythic Plus. It's much easier to check them out in the raid, and same goes for the healers that were buffed. Holy Priest was being buffed in healing, as well as Restoration Shaman being buffed in healing. You won't really see it in terms of HPS when it comes to the results in Mythic Plus. So the damage, as far as damage goes, when it comes to tanks and healers, that is also more or less remaining the same this week after the balance tuning. So when it comes to the tier list, when it comes to the supposed performances of the specs right now, in this week, so just at the start of this reset, we have some familiar icons at the top. We have seen these before multiple times. We haven't seen that often the mages, but as we mentioned, they have just been buffed. So their stocks, when it comes to meta value, have been rising. And then, of course, the one that is also not nearly as surprising is Windwalker, after the buffs, as it continues to rise in damage right now. Obviously, once you look at all of the affixes and the entire season, you have Windwalker dropping all the way back down, of course, but just looking at the recent changes, we can see some visible improvements when it comes to the damage of Windwalker, for example, as well as the damage of the mage specs, as well as the damage, even though it's not that impactful yet, of a spec like Destro. We do see, though, the damage of Havok being somewhat closer to the other specs when we go and look at tier lists compared to how we can see them here in the actual logs of the latest week, the average damage of Havok Demon Hunter. They are closer, right? They're not that drastically far ahead anymore. You see Outlaw, it's only 5 to 6% behind Havok. You see Demo, it's even closer than that. Windwalker is creeping up in terms of damage numbers as well. So the situation now is much closer than before in terms of gaps of performance when it comes to the DPS. We have mentioned this before, of course, that when it comes to tanks, the gap in damage is much more visible. Vengeance right now blasting in terms of damage, as well as these top two healers having much more unbalanced numbers compared to the DPS. If you look at the very top of the DPS here, being around 230-ish, you have well over half of the entire DPS being within 10% of the damage of the top DPS. But then you move to something like healers, for example, and there is Discipline doing 80% more damage than Holy. You have Mistweaver Monk doing 50% more damage than Holy Paladin. So when it comes to those numbers, they are much more unbalanced when it comes to healers, and also, but not nearly as badly, when it comes to tanks. So this is the situation as far as the performance of the specs in Mythic Plus after checking just how much did these buffs or nerfs impact each and every spec in Mythic Plus. For now, the more meaningful changes seem to be the buffs to Windwalker, the buffs to Fire and to Frost, as well as the buff to Destruction, plus the nerfs to, where is it now? The nerf to Assassination Rogue, which is right over there. These seem to be the more impactful one. The buffs to Devastation, unfortunately, especially given the popularity already of Augmentation, doesn't seem to have affected much. Same goes for the small Earthquake buff to Elemental, considering Earthquake is not really a big part of the damage of Elemental, as well as the very tiny buff, the 3%, I believe it was 3% damage buff to Ret. You can see it clearly, the damage increase. This last week they stopped the average DPS at 212. Before the buff they were at 200, so you can see the effects of the buff in this new week for Ret. Those are the general major effects of the balance tuning we have gotten this last reset of a week ago. We can finish, as usual, in style, our recap of Mythic Plus when it comes to the popular composition of last week up to basically a couple of days ago. We continue to see some more even splits between Vengeance and Prot Paladin when it comes to tanks, as well as some more options in the healer category. But what is clearly jumping to the eye in here, I am going to make it even easier to be noticeable, is that from the previous week prior to the balance tuning into this week after the balance tuning happened, you can clearly see the sudden appearance of mages all of a sudden in keys. This is actually a slight hidden buff for Restoration Druid, because Mage has Bloodlust, but Augmentation is also very meta and they also have Bloodlust. And as you can see, Havoc is also very meta and they don't have Combat Rest, and Vengeance is also very meta and they don't have Combat Rest. So this is a buff to Resto Druid. So because every time you have Vengeance, Havoc, plus Augmentation, plus the new entry of a Mage, you are left with 0 Combat Rests, and the only one that can bring it is a Druid. The other way around, if you want to bring the Discipline Priest, then you have to bring the Prot Paladin to fill in the Combat Rest. That seems to be the major change when it comes to the composition popularity of Mythic Plus. Mages are taking up the spot that we can say at the beginning of the season perhaps was closer or was more contended for Hunters as well as Rogues, right? As we kept going week after week, the Rogues and the Hunters started becoming fewer and fewer up to the buff week of the Mages, where the Hunters and the Rogues have disappeared from the top, I believe, 12 most used groups in Mythic Plus. We can also have a sneak peek of the first couple of days of this week. Obviously, this is just the first couple of days. Ret Paladin and Beast Mastery apparently are everywhere now, but we will see. We will see at the end of this week how will this shape up for this reset of Mythic Plus. But for today, when it comes to checking up what has changed in Mythic Plus given the balance tuning changes of last reset, we are done for today. We can now leave each other on this Thursday by saying our goodbyes. First of all, of course, the DR Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know what happened. I have like a virus nesting in my throat, which is making it annoying to talk.